Chapter 8. Far from the Madding Crowd. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Lucy Burgoyne. Far from the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy. Chapter 8. The Malthouse, the Chat, News. Warren's Malthouse was enclosed by an old wall enwrapped with ivy, and though not much of the exterior was visible at this hour, the character and purposes of the building were clearly enough shown by its outline upon the sky. From the walls an overhanging thatched roof sloped up to a point in the centre, upon which rose a small wooden lantern, fitted with louvered boards on all the four sides, and from these openings a mist was dimly perceived to be escaping into the night air. There was no window in front, but a square hole in the door was glazed with a single pane, through which red, comfortable rays now stretched out upon the ivied wall in front. Voices were to be heard inside. Oak's hand skimmed the surface of the door, with fingers extended to an Elmer's the Sorcerer pattern, till he found a leather strap, which he pulled. This lifted a wooden latch, and the door swung open. The room inside was lighted only by the ruddy glow from the kiln mouth, which shone over the floor with the streaming horizontality of the setting sun, and threw upwards the shadows of all facial irregularities in those assembled around. The stone flagged floor was worn into a path from the doorway to the kiln, and into undulations everywhere. A curved settle of unplanned oak stretched along one side, and in a remote corner was a small bed and bedstead, the owner and frequent occupier of which was the maltster. This aged man was now sitting opposite the fire, his frosty white hair and beard overgrowing his gnarled figure like the grey moss and lichen upon a leafless apple tree. He wore breeches and the laced-up shoes called ankle jacks. He kept his eyes fixed upon the fire. Gabriel's nose was greeted by an atmosphere laden with the sweet smell of new malt. The conversation, which seemed to have been concerning the origin of the fire, immediately ceased, and every one ocularly criticised him to the degree expressed by contracting the flesh of their foreheads and looking at him with narrowed eyelids, as if he had been a light too strong for their sight. Several exclaimed meditatively after this operation had been completed, "Oh, 'tis the new shepherd, I believe. We thought we heard a hand pawing about the door for the bobbin, but weren't sure 'twere not a dead leaf blowed across." Said another, "Come in, shepherd. Sure ye be welcome, though we don't know your name." "Gabriel Oak, that's my name, neighbours." The ancient maltster sitting in the midst turned at this, his turning being as the turning of a rusty crane. "That's never Gable Oak's grandson over at Norcombe, never," he said, as a formula expressive of surprise, which nobody was supposed for a moment to take literally. "My father and my grandfather were old men of the name of Gabriel," said the shepherd placidly. "Thought I knowed the man's face as I seed him on the rick. Thought I did. And where ye be trading ot to now, shepherd?" "I'm thinking of biding here," said Mr. Oak. "Knowed your grandfather for years and years," continued the maltster, the words coming forth of their own accord, as if the momentum previously imparted had been sufficient. "Ah, and did you? Knowed your grandmother? And her too? Likewise knowed your father when he was a child? Why, my boy Jacob there and your father were sworn brothers, that they were sure, weren't you, Jacob?" Ah, sure, said his son, a young man about 65, with a semi-bald head and one tooth in the left centre of his upper jaw, which made much of itself by standing prominent, like a milestone in a bank. But 'twas Joe had most do with him. However, my son William must have knowed the very man afore us, didn't you, Billy, afore you left Norcombe?" "No, 'twas Andrew," said Jacob's son Billy, a child of 40, or thereabouts, who manifested the peculiarity of possessing a cheerful soul in a gloomy body, and whose whiskers were assuming a chinchilla shade here and there. "I can mind Andrew," said Oak, "as being a man in the place when I was quite a child." "Ah, the other day I and my youngest daughter, Liddy, were over at my grandson's christening," continued Billy. "We were talking about this very family, and 'twas only last Purifaction Day in this very world, when the use money is guyed away to the second best poor folk, you know, shepherd, and I can mind the day because they all had to traps up to the vestry. Yes, this very man's family. Come, shepherd, and drink. 'Tis gape and swallow with us. A drab of sommet, but not of much account," said the maltster, removing from the fire his eyes, which were vermilion red and bleared by gazing into it for so many years. "Take up the God forgive me, Jacob. See if 'tis warm, Jacob." Jacob stooped to the God forgive me, which was a two-handled tall mug standing in the ashes, cracked and charred with heat. It was rather furred with extraneous matter about the outside, especially in the crevices of the handles, the innermost curves of which may not have seen daylight for several years by reason of this encrustation thereon, formed of ashes accidentally wetted with cider and baked hard. But to the mind of any sensible drinker, the cup was no worse for that, being incontestably clean on the inside and about the rim. It may be observed that such a class of mug is called a God forgive me in Weatherbury and its vicinity for uncertain reasons, probably because its size makes any given toper feel ashamed of himself when he sees its bottom in drinking it empty. Jacob, on receiving the order to see if the liquor was warm enough, placidly dipped his forefinger into it by way of thermometer, and having pronounced it nearly of the proper degree, raised the cup and very civilly attempted to dust some of the ashes from the bottom with the skirt of his smock frock, because shepherd Oak was a stranger. "A clean cup for the shepherd," said the maltster commandingly. "No, not at all," said Gabriel, in a reproving tone of considerateness. "I never fuss about dirt in its pure state, and when I know what sort it is." Taking the mug he drank an inch or more from the depth of its contents, and duly passed it to the next man. "I wouldn't think of giving such trouble to neighbours in washing up when there's so much work to be done in the world already," continued Oak in a moistened tone, after recovering from the stoppage of breath which is occasioned by pulls at large mugs. "A right sensible man," said Jacob. "True, true, it can't be gainsaid," observed a brisk young man, Mark Clark by name, a genial and pleasant gentleman, whom to meet anywhere in your travels was to know was to drink with, and to drink with was, unfortunately, to pay for. "And here's a mouthful of bread and bacon that missus have sent, shepherd. The cider will go down better with a bit of victuals. Don't ye chew quite close, shepherd, for I left the bacon fall in the road outside as I was bringing it along, and maybe 'tis rather gritty. There, 'tis clam dirt, and we all know what that is, as you say, and you bain't a particular man, we see, shepherd." "True, true, not at all," said the friendly Oak. Don't let your teeth quite meet, and you won't feel the sandiness at all. Ah, 'tis wonderful what can be done by contrivance." "My own mind exactly, neighbour." "Ah, he's his grandfar's own grandson. His grandfar were just such a nice, unparticular man," said the maltster. "Drink, Henry Fray, drink," magnanimously said Jan Coggan, a person who held Saint Simonian notions of share and share alike where liquor was concerned, as the vessel showed signs of approaching him in its gradual revolution among them. Having at this moment reached the end of a wistful gaze into mid-air, Henry did not refuse. He was a man of more than middle age, with eyebrows high up in his forehead, who laid it down that the law of the world was bad, with a long-suffering look through his listeners at the world alluded to, as it presented itself to his imagination. He always signed his name Henery, strenuously insisting upon that spelling, and if any passing schoolmaster ventured to remark that the second E was superfluous and old-fashioned, he received the reply that Henery was the name he was christened, and the name he would stick to, in the tone of which to whom orthographical differences were matters which had a great deal to do with personal character. Mr. Jan Coggan, who had passed the cup to Henery, was a crimson man with a spacious countenance and private glimmer in his eye, whose name had appeared on the marriage register of Weatherbury and neighbouring parishes as best man and chief witness in countless unions of the previous 20 years. He also very frequently filled the post of head godfather in baptisms of the supply jovial kind. "Come, Mark Clark, come, there's plenty more in the barrel," said Jan. "Ah, that I will. 'Tis my only doctor," replied Mr. Clark, who, 20 years younger than Jan Coggan, revolved in the same orbit. He secreted mirth on all occasions for special discharge at popular parties. "Why, Joseph Poorgrass, ye hadn't had a drop," said Mr. Coggan to a self-conscious man in the background, thrusting the cup towards him. "Such a modest man as he is," said Jacob Smallbury. "Why, you've hardly had strength of eye enough to look in our young miss's face." "So I hear, Joseph." All looked at Joseph Poorgrass with pitying reproach. "No, I've hardly looked at her at all," simpered Joseph, reducing his body smaller whilst talking, apparently from a meek sense of undue prominence. "And when I seed her, 'twas nothing but blushes with me." "Poor feller," said Mr. Clark. "'Tis a curious nature for a man," said Jan Coggan. "Yes," continued Joseph Poorgrass, his shyness, which was so painful as a defect, filling him with a mild complacency now that it was regarded as an interesting study. "'Twere blush with me every minute of the time when she was speaking to me." "I believe you, Joseph Poorgrass, for we all know you to be a very bashful man." "'Tis a awkward gift for a man, poor soul," said the maltster. "And how long have you suffered from it, Joseph?" "Oh, ever since I was a boy. Yes, mother was concerned to her heart about it. Yes, but 'twas all naught." "Did he ever go into the world to try and stop it, Joseph Poorgrass?" "Oh, ay, tried all sorts of company. They took me to Greenhill Fair, and into a great gay jerry-go-nimble show, where there were womenfolk riding round, standing upon horses, with hardly anything on but their smocks, but it didn't cure me a morsel, and then I was put errand-man at the women's skittle alley at the back of the Taylor's Arms in Casterbridge. 'Twas a horrible sinful situation, and a very curious place for a good man. I had to stand and look faddy people in the face from morning till night, but 'twas no use. I was just as bad as ever after all. Blushes have been in the family for generations. There, 'tis a happy providence that I be no worse." "True," said Jacob Smallbury, deepening his thoughts to a profounder view of the subject. "'Tis a thought to look at, that ye might have been worse. But even as you be, 'tis a very bad affliction for 'ee, Joseph. For ye see, shepherd, though 'tis very well for a woman, dang it all, 'tis awkward for a man like him, poor feller." "'Tis," said Gabriel, recovering from a meditation. "Yes, very awkward for the man." "Ah, and he's very timid too," observed Jan Cogan. "Once he had been working late at Yelbury Bottom, and had had a drab of drink, and lost his way as he was coming home along through Yelbury Wood. Didn't yer, Master Poorgrass?" No, not that story," expostulated the modest man, forcing a laugh to bury his concern. "And so a lost himself quite," continued Mr. Cogan, with an impassive face, implying that a true narrative, like time and tide, must run its course and would respect no man. "And as he was coming along in the middle of the night, much afeared, and not able to find his way out of the trees nohow, a cried out, 'Man a lost! Man a lost!' A owl in a tree happened to be crying, 'Hoo hoo hoo,' as owls do, you know, shepherd." Gabriel nodded. "And Joseph, all in a tremble, said, 'Joseph Poorgrass of Weatherbury, sir.'" No, now that's too much," said the timid man, becoming a man of brazen courage all of a sudden. "I didn't say, sir, I'll take my oath, I didn't say, Joseph Poorgrass of Weatherbury, sir. No, what's right is right, and I never said sir to the bird, knowing wer well that no man of a gentleman's rank would be hollering there at that time o' night. Joseph Poorgrass of Weatherbury, that's every word I said, and I shouldn't ha' said that if 't hadn't been for Keeper Day's metheglin. There, 'twas a merciful thing it ended where it did." The question of which was right being tacitly waived by the company, Jan went on meditatively. "And he's the fearfullest man, bain't yer, Joseph? Ah, another time ye were lost by Lambing Down Gate, weren't yer, Joseph?" "I was," replied Poorgrass, as if there were some conditions too serious even for modesty to remember itself under, this being one. "Yes, that were the middle of the night too. The gate would not open, try how he would, and knowing there was the devil's hand in it, he kneeled down." "Ah," said Joseph, acquiring confidence from the warmth of the fire, the cider, and a perception of the narrative capabilities of the experience alluded to. "My heart died within me that time, but I kneeled down and said the Lord's Prayer, and then the belief right through, and then the 10 Commandments in earnest prayer. But no, the gate wouldn't open, and then I went on with dearly beloved brethren, and, thinks I, this makes 4, and 'tis all I know out of book, and if this don't do it nothing will, and I'm a lost man. Well, when I got to saying after me, I rose from my knees and found the gate would open. Yes, neighbours, the gate opened, the same as ever." A meditation on the obvious inference was indulged in by all, and during its continuance each directed his vision into the ash pit which glowed like a desert in the tropics under a vertical sun, shaping their eyes long and liny, partly because of the light, partly from the depth of the subject discussed. Gabriel broke the silence. "What sort of a place is this to live at, and what sort of a missus is she to work under?" Gabriel's bosom thrilled gently as he thus slipped under the notice of the assembly the innermost subject of his heart. "We've know little of her, nothing. She only showed herself a few days ago. Her uncle was took bad, and the doctor was called with his world-wide skill, but he couldn't save the man. As I take it, she's going to keep on the farm." "That's about the shape o't, I believe," said Jan Cogan. "Ah, 'tis a very good family. I'd as soon be under 'em as under one here and there. Her uncle was a very fair sort of man." "Did you know un, shepherd, a bachelor man?" "Not at all. I used to go to his house a courting my first wife, Charlotte, who was his dairymaid. Well, a very good-hearted man, were Farmer Everdene, and I being a respectable young fellow, was allowed to call and see her and drink as much ale as I liked, but not to carry away any outside my skin, I mane, of course." "Aye, aye, Jane Cogan, we know ye, Manning. And so you see 'twas beautiful ale, and I wished to value his kindness as much as I could, but not to be so ill-mannered as to drink only a thimbleful, which would have been insulting the man's generosity." "True, Master Cogan, 'twould so," corroborated Mark Clark. "And so I used to eat a lot o' salt fish afore going, and then by the time I got there I were as dry as a lime basket, so thorough dry that that ale would slip down, eh? 'Twould slip down sweet." "Happy times, heavenly times, such lovely drunks as I used to have at that house. You can mind, Jacob, you used to go with me sometimes." I can," said Jacob. "That one too, that we had at Buck's Head on a White Monday was a pretty tipple." "'Twas, but for a wet o' the better class. That brought you no nearer to the horned man than you were afore you begun. There was none like those in Farmer Everdene's kitchen. Not a single dam allowed. No, not a bare poor one, even at the most cheerful moment when all were blinders, though the good old word of sin thrown in here and there at sometimes is a great relief to a merry soul." "True," said the maltster. "Natur requires her swearing at the regular times, or she's not herself, and unholy exclamations is a necessity of life." "But Charlotte," continued Cogan, "not a word of the sort would Charlotte allow, nor the smallest item of taking in vain. Ah, poor Charlotte! I wonder if she'd had the good fortune to get into heaven when 'a died. But 'a was never much in luck's way, and perhaps 'a went downwards after all, poor soul." "And did any of you know Miss Everdene's father and mother?" inquired the shepherd, who found some difficulty in keeping the conversation in the desired channel. "I knew them a little," said Jacob Smallbury, "but they were townsfolk, and didn't live here. They've been dead for years. Father, what sort of people were Mrs. father and mother?" "Well," said the maltster, "he wasn't much to look at, but she was a lovely woman. He was fond enough of her as his sweetheart. Used to kiss her scores and long hundreds of times." "So 'twas said," observed Cogan. "He was very proud of her, too, when they were married, as I've been told," said the maltster. "Ah," said Cogan, "he admired her so much that he used to light the candle 3 times a night to look at her." "Boundless love! I shouldn't have supposed it in the universe," murmured Joseph Poorgrass, who habitually spoke on a large scale in his moral reflections. "Well, to be sure," said Gabriel. "Oh, 'tis true enough. I know the man and woman both well. Levi Everdene, that was the man's name, sure." "Man," saith I, in my hurry, "but he were of a higher circle of life than that. A was a gentleman tailor really, worth scores of pounds, and he became a very celebrated bankrupt 2 or 3 times." "Oh, I thought he was quite a common man," said Joseph. "Oh, no, no, that man failed for heaps of money, hundreds in gold and silver." The maltster, being rather short of breath, Mr. Cogan, after absently scrutinizing a coal which had fallen among the ashes, took up the narrative, with a private twirl of his eye. "Well now, you'd hardly believe it, but that man, our Miss Everdene's father, was one of the ficklest husbands alive, after a while. Understand? I didn't want to be fickle, but he couldn't help it. The poor feller were faithful and true enough to her in his wish, but his heart would rove, do what he would. He spoke to me in real tribulation about it once. 'Cogan,' he said, 'I could never wish for a handsomer woman than I've got, but feeling she's ticketed as my lawful wife, I can't help my wicked heart wandering, do what I will.' But at last I believe he cured it by making her take off her wedding ring, and calling her by her maiden name, as they sat together after the shop was shut. And so I would get to fancy she was only his sweetheart, and not married to him at all. And as soon as he could thoroughly fancy he was doing wrong and committing the seventh, I got to like her as well as ever, and they lived on a perfect picture of mutual love." "Well, 'twas a most ungodly remedy," murmured Joseph Poorgrass, "but we ought to feel deep cheerfulness that a happy Providence kept it from being any worse. You see, he might have gone the bad road, and given his eyes to unlawfulness entirely, yes, gross unlawfulness, so to say it." "You see," said Billy Smallbury, "the man's will was to do right, sure enough, but his heart didn't chime in. He got so much better that he was quite godly in his latter years, wasn't he, Jan?" said Joseph Poorgrass. "He got himself confirmed over again in a more serious way, and took to saying 'Amen' almost as loud as the clerk, and he liked to copy comforting verses from the tombstones. He used, too, to hold the money plate at 'Let your light so shine,' and stand godfather to poor little come by chance children. And he kept a missionary box upon his table to nab folks unawares when they called. Yes, and he would box the charity boys' ears, if they laughed in church, till they could hardly stand upright, and do other deeds of piety natural to the saintly inclined. Ah, at that time he thought of nothing but high things," added Billy Smallbury. "One day Parson Thirdly met him and said, 'Good morning, Mr. Everdene, 'tis a fine day.' 'Amen,' said Everdene, quite absent-like, thinking only of religion when he seed a parson. Yes, he was a very Christian man." "Their daughter was not at all a pretty child at that time," said Henry Fray. "Never should have thought she'd have grown up such a handsome body as she is. 'Tis to be hoped her temper is as good as her face." "Well, yes, but the Bailey will have most to do with the business and ourselves." Ah, Henry gazed into the ash pit, and smiled volumes of ironical knowledge. "A queer Christian, like the devil's head in a cow." [Footnote: This phrase is a conjectural emendation of the unintelligible expression, "as the devil said to the owl," used by the natives. End of footnote. "As the saying is," volunteered Mark Clark. "He is," said Henry, implying that irony must cease at a certain point. "Between we two, man and man, I believe that man would as soon tell a lie Sundays as working days that I do so." "Good faith, you do talk," said Gabriel. "True enough," said the man of bitter moods, looking round upon the company with the antithetic laughter that comes from a keener appreciation of the miseries of life than ordinary men are capable of. "Ah, there's people of one sort, and people of another, but that man, bless your souls!" Gabriel thought fit to change the subject. "You must be a very aged man, Malta, to have sons growed mild and ancient," he remarked. "Father's so old that I can't mind his age, can you, father?" interposed Jacob. "And he's growed terrible crooked too, lately," Jacob continued, surveying his father's figure, which was rather more bowed than his own. "Really, one may say that father there is three double." "Crooked folk will last a long while," said the maltster, grimly, and not in the best humour. "Shepherd would like to hear the pedigree of your life, father, wouldn't you, Shepherd?" "Ah, that I should," said Gabriel, with the heartiness of a man who had longed to hear it for several months. "What may your age be, Malta?" The maltster cleared his throat in an exaggerated form for emphasis, and elevating his gaze to the remotest point of the ash pit, said, in the slow speech justifiable when the importance of a subject is so generally felt that any mannerism must be tolerated in getting at it, "Well, I don't mind the year I were born in, but p'raps I can reckon up the places I've lived at, and so get it that way. I boated up a long puddle across there," nodding to the north, "till I were 11. I bode 7 at Kingsbere," nodding to the east, "where I took to malting. I went therefrom to Norcombe, and malted there 22 years, and 22 years I was there turnip hoeing and harvesting." "Ah, I knowed that old place, Norcombe, years afore you were thought of, Master Oak." Oak smiled sincere belief in the fact. "Then I malted at Durnover 4 year, and 4 year turnip hoeing, and I was 14 times 11 months at Millpond, St. Jude's," nodding northwest by north. "Old Twills wouldn't hire me for more than 11 months at a time, to keep me from being chargeable to the parish if so be I was disabled. Then I was 3 year at Mellstock, and I've been here 31 year, come Candlemas." "How much is that?" "117," chuckled another old gentleman, giving to mental arithmetic and little conversation, who had hitherto sat unobserved in a corner. "Well, then, that's my age," said the maltster, emphatically. "Oh, no, father," said Jacob. "Your turnip hoeing were in the summer, and your malting in the winter of the same years, and you don't ought to count both halves, father." "Chock it all! I lived through the summers, didn't I? That's my question. I suppose you'll say next I be no age at all to speak of." "Sure we shan't," said Gabriel, soothingly. "You be a very old aged person, Malta," attested Jan Cogan, also soothingly. "We all know that. And you must have a wonderful talented constitution to be able to live so long, mustn't he, neighbours?" "True, true, you must, Malta. Wonderful," said the meeting unanimously. The maltster, being now pacified, was even generous enough to voluntarily disparage in a slight degree the virtue of having lived a great many years, by mentioning that the cup they were drinking out of was 3 years older than he. While the cup was being examined, the end of Gabriel's oak's flute became visible over his smock frock pocket, and Henry Fray exclaimed, "Surely, Shepherd, I seed you growing into a great flute by now at Casterbridge." "You did," said Gabriel, blushing faintly. "I've been in a great trouble, neighbours, and I was driven to it. I used not to be so poor as I be now." "Never mind heart," said Mark Clark. "You should take it careless like, Shepherd, and your time will come. But we could thank you for a tune, if you bain't too tired." "Neither drum nor trumpet have I heard since Christmas," said Jane Cogan. "Come, raise a tune, Master Oak." "Ah, that I will," said Gabriel, pulling out his flute and putting it together. "A poor tool, neighbours, but such as I can do ye shall have and welcome. Oak then struck up "Jockey to the Fair," and played that sparkling melody 3 times through, accenting the notes in the third round in a most artistic and lively manner by bending his body in small jerks and tapping with his foot to beat time. "He can blow the flute very well, that 'a can," said a young married man, who, having no individuality worth mentioning, was known as Susan Tall's husband. He continued, "I'd as lief as not be able to blow into a flute as well as that." "He's a clever man, and 'tis a true comfort for us to have such a shepherd," murmured Joseph Poorgrass, in a soft cadence. "We ought to feel full of thanksgiving that he's not a player about his songs instead of these merry tunes, for 'twould have been just as easy for God to have made the shepherd a loose low man, a man of iniquity, so to speak, as what he is. Yes, for our wives' and daughters' sakes we should feel real thanksgiving." "True, true, real thanksgiving," dashed in Mark Clark conclusively, not feeling it to be of any consequence to his opinion that he had only heard about a word and 3/4 of what Joseph had said. "Yes," added Joseph, beginning to feel like a man in the Bible, "for evil do thrive so in these times, that ye may be as much deceived in the cleanest shaved and whitest shirted man as in the raggedest tramp upon the turnpike, if I may term it so." "Ah, I can mind your face now, shepherd," said Henry Fray, criticising Gabriel with misty eyes as he entered upon his second tune. "Yes, now I see ye blowing into the flute. I know ye to be the same man I see play at Casterbridge, for ye mouth were scrimped up and ye eyes a staring out like a strangled man's, just as they be now." "'Tis a pity that playing the flute should make a man look such a scarecrow," observed Mr. Mark Clark, with additional criticism of Gabriel's countenance, the latter person jerking out, with the ghastly grimace required by the instrument, the chorus of Dame Durden: "'Twas Moll and Bet, and Doll and Kate, and Dorothy Draggle Tail." "I hope you don't mind that young man's bad manners in naming your features," whispered Joseph to Gabriel. "Not at all," said Mr. Oak. "For my nature ye be a very handsome man, shepherd," continued Joseph Poorgrass, with winning suavity. "Ah, that ye be, shepherd," said the company. "Thank you very much," said Oak, in the modest tone good manners demanded, thinking, however, that he would never let Bathsheba see him playing the flute, in this resolve showing a discretion equal to that related to its sagacious inventress, the divine Minerva herself. "Ah, when I and my wife were married at Norcombe Church," said the old maltster, not pleased at finding himself left out of the subject, "we were called the handsomest couple in the neighbourhood. Everybody said so." "Danged if ye bain't altered now, Malta," said a voice with the vigour natural to the enunciation of a remarkably evident truism. It came from the old man in the background, whose offensiveness and spiteful ways were barely atoned for by the occasional chuckle he contributed to general laughs. "Oh, no, no," said Gabriel. "Don't you play no more shepherd," said Susan Tall's husband, the young married man who had spoken once before. "I must be moving, and when there's tunes going on I seem as if hung in wires. If I thought after I'd left that music was still playing, and I not there, I should be quite melancholy like." "What's your hurry then, Laban?" inquired Cogan. "You used to bide as late as the latest." "Well, you see, neighbours, I was lately married to a woman, and she's my vocation now, and so you see—" the young man halted lamely. "New lords, new laws, as the saying is, I suppose," remarked Cogan. "Ah, "I believe," ha ha, said Susan Tall's husband, in a tone intended to imply his habitual reception of jokes without minding them at all. The young man then wished them good night, and withdrew. Henry Fray was the first to follow. Then Gabriel arose and went off with Jan Cogan, who had offered him a lodging. A few minutes later, when the remaining ones were on their legs and about to depart, Fray came back again in a hurry. Flourishing his finger ominously, he threw a gaze teeming with tidings just where his eye alighted by accident, which happened to be in Joseph Poorgrass's face. "Oh, what's the matter? What's the matter, Henry?" said Joseph, starting back. "What's a brewing, Henry?" asked Jacob and Mark Clark. "Bailey Pennyways, Bailey Pennyways. I said so. Yes, I said so." "What, found out stealing anything?" "Stealing it is. The news is that after Miss Everdene got home she went out again to see all was safe, as she usually do, and coming in found Bailey Pennyways creeping down the granary steps with half a bushel of barley. She fled at him like a cat. Never such a tomboy as she is. Of course I speak with closed doors." You do, Henry." "She fled at him, and, to cut a long story short, he owned to having carried off 5 sack altogether, upon her promising not to persecute him. Well, he's turned out neck and crop, and my question is, who's going to be Bailey now?" The question was such a profound one that Henry was obliged to drink there and then from the large cup till the bottom was distinctly visible inside. Before he had replaced it on the table, in came the young man, Susan Tall's husband, in a still greater hurry. "Have you heard the news that all over parish about Bailey Pennyways?" But besides that, "No, not a morsel of it," they replied, looking into the very midst of Laban Tall, as if to meet his words half-way down his throat. "What a night of horrors!" murmured Joseph Poorgrass, waving his hands spasmodically. "I've had the news bell ring in my left ear quite bad enough for a murder, and I've seen a magpie all alone. Fanny Robin, Miss Everdene's youngest servant, can't be found. They've been wanting to lock up the door these 2 hours, but she isn't come in, and they don't know what to do about going to bed for fear of locking her out. They wouldn't be so concerned if she hadn't been noticed in such low spirits these last few days. And Marianne, to think the beginning of a coroner's inquest has happened to the poor girl." "Oh, 'tis burned, 'tis burned," came from Joseph Poorgrass's dry lips. "No, 'tis drowned," said Tall. "Or 'tis her father's razor," suggested Billy Smallbury, with a vivid sense of detail. "Well, Miss Everdene wants to speak to the one or two of us before we go to bed. What with this trouble about the Bailey, and now about the girl, Missus is almost wild." They all hastened up the lane to the farmhouse, excepting the old maltster, whom neither news, fire, rain, nor thunder could draw from his hole. There, as the other's footsteps died away, he sat down again and continued gazing as usual into the furnace with his red, bleared eyes. From the bedroom window above their heads, Bathsheba's head and shoulders, robed in mystic white, were dimly seen extended into the air. "Are any of my men among you?" she said anxiously. "Yes, ma'am, several," said Susan Tall's husband. "To-morrow morning I wish to all 3 of you to make inquiries in the villages round if they have seen such a person as Fanny Robin. Do it quietly. There is no reason for alarm as yet. She must have left whilst we were all at the fire." "I beg your pardon, but had she any young man courting her in the parish, ma'am?" asked Jacob Smallbury. "I don't know," said Bathsheba. "I've never heard of any such thing, ma'am," said 2 or 3. It is hardly likely, either," continued Bathsheba, "for any lover of hers might have come to the house if he had been a respectable lad. The most mysterious matter connected with her absence, indeed. The only thing which gives me serious alarm is that she was seen to go out of the house by Marianne with only her indoor working gown on, not even a bonnet." "And you mean, ma'am, excusing my words, that a young woman would hardly go to see a young man without dressing up," said Jacob, turning his mental vision upon past experiences. "That's true, she would not, ma'am. She had, I think, a bundle, though I couldn't see very well," said a female voice from another window, which seemed that of Marianne. "But she had no young man about here. Hers lives in Casterbridge, and I believe he's a soldier." "Do you know his name?" Bathsheba said. "No, mistress. She was very close about it." "Perhaps I might be able to find out if I went to Casterbridge barracks," said William Smallbury. "Very well, if she doesn't return to morrow. Mind you go there and try to discover which man it is, and see him." "I feel more responsible than I should if she had had any friends or relations alive." "I do hope she has come to no harm through a man of that kind. And then there's this disgraceful affair of the bailiff. But I can't speak of him now." Bathsheba had so many reasons for uneasiness that it seemed she did not think it worth while to dwell upon any particular one. "Do as I told you, then," she said, in conclusion, closing the casement. "Aye, aye, mistress, we will," they replied, and moved away. That night at Cogan's, Gabriel Oak, beneath the screen of closed eyelids, was busy with fancies, and full of movement, like a river flowing rapidly under its ice. Night had always been the time at which he saw Bathsheba most vividly, and through the slow hours of shadow he tenderly regarded her image now. It is rarely that the pleasures of the imagination will compensate for the pain of sleeplessness, but they possibly did with Oak tonight, for the delight of merely seeing her effaced for the time his perception of the great difference between seeing and possessing. He also thought of plans for fetching his few utensils and books from Norcombe, the young man's best companion, the farrier's sure guide, the veterinary surgeon, Paradise Lost, the Pilgrim's Progress, Robinson Crusoe, Ash's Dictionary, and walking games, arithmetic, constituted his library. And though a limited series, it was one from which he had acquired more sound information by diligent perusal than many a man of opportunities has done from a forlong of laden shelves. Chapter 8.